Thank you all for coming. This is a great group. It's my pleasure to introduce Kevin Kroeger, a senior scientist at the US Geological Survey Coastal and Marine Science Center at Woods Hole. He studies blue carbon systems and coastal ecosystems, which have a lot to do with gas fluxes and in terms of making the past, present, and future life on Earth possible. And so we're going to have Kevin give a 20-minute or so talk. I think he's going to share his screen and some slides. Feel free to chat about anything you want, but hopefully the stuff we're talking about in the chat box. And then we'll have an open discussion among all of us about how we might translate some of the science into different educational settings, audiences, applications for the rest of the hour. So I'm going to turn it over to Kevin.
Okay, great. Thanks, Bob. Thanks everyone for coming. So I'm going to show about 17 or so slides. I think given the size of this group, it's fine if people want to chime in with any questions as we go, because I don't think it'll be too disruptive. But see already that I can't reach my, there it is. Okay. Okay. So as Bob said, I'm going to be talking about carbon and greenhouse gases in tidal wetlands. So these are salt marshes and mangroves. We're zooming in on the very narrow coastal fringe of the oceans, but they're still oceans. They only comprise a few percent of the area of the ocean basins. And so you might ask, how could this very narrow ribbon of 3% or so of the ocean be important to making the Earth livable? So the first answer is that salt marshes, mangroves, other tidal wetlands are critical habitat for lots of animals and marine animals, terrestrial animals, birds, and for plants as well. You probably know that they're nurseries for commercially important species, as well as critical members of the food web in the coastal ocean and even in the open ocean. They also protect our coasts from tide surges and storm surges and waves. So already a pretty good set of services they provide for us. But we're going to zoom in a little bit more and talk specifically about their role in the carbon cycle and how they can be part of our solution to climate change. So here we have Great Barnstable Marsh here on Cape Cod. It's a very large, very healthy, abundant salt marsh, and these are some of our instruments deployed to measure continuous gas fluxes. And this inset here shows a cross-section of salt marsh peat. And this is, by volume, this is mostly carbon. So there's very important carbon stores. So how should we think about the role of salt marshes and mangroves in climate change mitigation and in climate change that's already happened? If you look at this example, this one scenario from the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, this shows annual total greenhouse gas emissions globally. And most of what you see here are fossil fuel emissions. In brown here, we have agricultural, forestry, and other land uses. So our tidal wetlands are in here. This is depicting them, the ecosystems as a source. This is because of things like deforestation, wetland drainage, impoundment, and filling. soil management that produces emissions from soils, et cetera. So because of these really intensive and widespread land uses, our ecosystems that have been part of our problem with climate change. Looking at a little bit bigger picture, all of these fossil fuels, actually their original source is ecosystems as well. In fact, coal is mostly from peatlands, so a form of these wetlands. So what we've been doing is taking millions of years worth of carbon storage by ecosystems, combusting it and producing CO2 emissions and creating this climate change problem that we're trying to address. So part of addressing it is to restore ecosystems, conserve ecosystems, and convert this emission into a sink, a removal of greenhouse gases from the atmosphere. So you might look at this brown portion of this graphic and think this is too small to really matter. But I'll point out that because our emissions are not coming down fast enough, we're going to, in order to try to meet the current targets for mitigating climate change, we're going to need to remove a lot of greenhouse gases from the atmosphere. We don't really have good technologies for doing that, except for photosynthesis at this moment. There may be future technologies, widespread deployment, that can also remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere or even methane, but some of those may have some negative consequences. Restoring ecosystems really doesn't. And so this sink here is actually significant relative to the sink that's needed later in the century relative to reduced fossil fuel emissions. Coastal tidal wetlands are really critical sites, hotspots for carbon cycling. They're kind of a crossroads, a superhighway, and a warehouse for carbon all at the same time. And so what I mean by that is the plants photosynthesize very rapidly. Since the soil is inundated with water, a lot of the carbon that they put into their root systems ends up being preserved for long time periods. So they have a very high rate of carbon storage in the soil. They exchange materials and carbon with the coastal ocean. So that's kind of the highway part. Turns out that's actually perhaps the biggest part of what they do is they take up carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and they export it to the coastal ocean as dissolved organic matter and dissolved inorganic matter. That's something that Bob and I are both intensely interested in and have been working on for quite a while. They can also be a source of methane to the atmosphere. And I think everyone knows that methane is a particularly potent greenhouse gas. It's very strong focus in Glasgow at the COP conference at this particular moment. There's a new international agreement to reduce methane emissions. But wetlands are hotspots for methane emissions, but I'll get into that a little bit more. We may have good options for managing them. So I'm going to talk a little bit in more detail about the lateral flux, so this aquatic exchange of carbon, and climate change mitigation potential by changing the way we manage wetlands. So what do how do these wetlands produce a lateral flux, an aquatic exchange with the ocean? Well, there's every day or twice a day, there's a high tide and a low tide in these settings. The high tides fill the wetland and the pore spaces, macropores and micropores in the soil with water. And those exchange detrital carbon, it could be particulate organic carbon or dissolved organic carbon, root leachates of dissolved organic carbon, respired CO2, which forms bicarbonate mostly when it reacts with seawater. All of these are then carried back out to sea by the tides when the tide falls. So this is a cross section of one creek or ditch in a salt marsh. If you look at the graphic, the inset on the right, this is a high resolution elevation image based on LiDAR, which is sort of like radar, except it uses lasers. And so this very high resolution elevation shows you a huge number of creeks and ditches that are equivalent to this diagram here on the left. So it's very complex. So how did we tackle that complexity? In this project, we chose a small, well understood portion of a salt marsh, this particular creek right here. We built a boardwalk, we put a bridge across it, and at that bridge, we deployed this suite of sensors, including one that gave us continuous data on water exchanges with the ocean, and some others that allowed us to monitor water chemistry and concentrations of some of the gases. So our key questions were, how large or fast are the exports? Can they be predicted? And what happens to carbon after it's exported to the coastal ocean? And I'll just tell you, with this third one, we're still working on. So we deployed those sensors and we started collecting samples, and we spent a lot of time out on the salt marsh, and we kept spending time out on the salt marsh, and we kept spending time out on the salt marsh. And we got a huge amount of data over about 4 years, a little over 4 years. So this is an example of some of the data. This shows flow, cubic meters per second, in and out of the marsh creek, and dissolved organic carbon, so detrital dissolved carbon flux, grams of carbon per second, in and out of the salt marsh creek over a spring neap cycle. So you can see there's a huge variability in import, so that's the positive numbers, and export, that's the negative numbers. There's a lot of water and carbon just fluxing in and out of the salt marsh continuously. Some of the key findings were that carbon exchange rates vary continuously on all time scales, individual tides, day, night, spring neap cycles, seasonally, monthly, 1 year to the next year. So it's a pretty difficult problem to estimate this flux over time. But we did find that the concentrations of the dissolved carbon forms, inorganic and organic, can be estimated at high frequency based on the sensor data. And this is an example of one of the multiple linear regression equations used to predict the dissolved inorganic carbon based on salinity, season, pH, and oxidation reduction potential in the water. So that's an indication of how much drainage is contained in the water at a particular time. That drainage is enriched in marsh carbon. So with that, we're able to get a new kind of data, high frequency fluxes. If we look at all these together, we get what I like to call a tornado of dissolved organic carbon in this case. It looks the same for the inorganic carbon. So these are the instantaneous flux rates. This is simply flow times concentration every few minutes. So that's pretty tough to interpret. This is about 140,000 observations. So again, we need to figure out how to tame the variability here. It turns out that if we analyze the data for each tide cycle, so we integrate over time all of the ins and outs of carbon, the fluxes into the marsh, the fluxes out, we sum those across individual tidal cycles, we start to reach some interpretable data. And just briefly on this left-hand graphic, you see net dissolved organic carbon flux for each tide, in units of grams of carbon per meter squared of marsh per year. So it's just a rate at which it's exchanging for individual tides. And on the left, we have the height of the high tide, and then we bend those together. There are dozens to hundreds of tides in each of these points here. And what you can see is very small tides during neap cycles don't flux much carbon, but when we start to flood more of the marsh, we get a larger flux out to the coastal ocean. So with that, we start to see how we might be able to interpret and predict these fluxes based on the elevation of the marsh platform and the heights of the tides. And it turns out these fluxes are pretty large relative to all of the other coastal carbon, coastal ocean carbon fluxes. So this is an important part of the budget. And importantly, this carbon, once it leaves the marsh, is no longer in the atmosphere. It's dissolved in the ocean, and it's not contributing to climate change. It's no longer trapping heat. And Bob, you'll have to tell me how much time I have. I have no idea. I'm moving on to part 2 here. So this is about changes to wetland hydrology. So this is a satellite photo here of the coast of Delaware. We have a lot of farm fields. All of this green out here is salt marsh, but identified in land cover databases there are a bunch of misclassifications of our coastal landscape. This is identified as a pond or a lake. All of these purple ones are. Those are actually former salt marsh that are on the landward side of roads. And those roads, or dikes in some cases, cut off the hydrology. They prevent the salt water from getting in there. And in this case, they cause accumulation of fresh water. So they turn into a lake or a pond or a freshwater wetland. We also have areas here that are identified as agricultural, but they're actually former wetlands. They've been diked and drained for agriculture. So these have massive consequences for carbon cycling. And I'll get into that a little bit more. So one of the reasons they have massive consequences is that these kinds of locations with managed hydrology behind roads or railroads or behind dikes and berms, et cetera, seawalls, they're incredibly abundant. So here's just a view of Cape Cod and the islands here and some of the mainland of Massachusetts. In this view, we have over 1,000 locations where roads cross the intertidal space, and in many cases, they'll affect the wetland hydrology. So we're mapping this nationally. We want to identify all the portions of the coast that are cut off by roads or railroads or are diked and drained for other land uses. So far, we've estimated that about 30 to 40% of former tidal wetland space is in this kind of impaired and degraded condition. And that, because the area is substantial, has significant consequences for carbon cycling. So what are those consequences? A natural salt marsh, as I mentioned, takes up a lot of CO2 from the atmosphere and stores it. It doesn't emit very much methane because there's lots of sulfate in seawater, and the microorganisms under anaerobic conditions in the soils, they respire organic matter using sulfate as their terminal electron acceptor rather than the methanogenesis pathway. So methane emissions are suppressed. They build soil volume over time. They gain elevation with sea level rise. If we block them with a road and an undersized culvert, for example, we cause retention of freshwater drainage from the landscape. The wetland becomes a freshwater wetland, and that reduces the amount of sulfate from seawater and enhances methane emissions. So we've taken something that was cooling the climate and turned it into something that's warming the climate. Similarly, if we dike and drain a wetland, we remove the water from the pore spaces, we drop the water table, and that exposes centuries or thousands of years worth of stored soil carbon to oxygen in the atmosphere, and you can get a massive carbon dioxide flux. And here in the bottom left, we can talk about this a little bit more in terms of educational content. We've calculated the impact on global heat budgets due to typical salt marsh carbon uptake rates and storage. This is on the negative side of this graphic, meaning it's cooling the climate, versus an impounded salt marsh with enhanced methane emissions, or a drained marsh with enhanced CO2 emissions. You can see that we take something that cooled climate and made it into something that warms it substantially. So as a prime example, this is one of our primary study sites. It's at the Cape Cod National Seashore. This is National Park Service land. This area here that's low elevation has a distinct color here, all the way through all these portions. That's all former salt marsh and estuary that was diked when this dike was built about 100 years ago. And it was either drained or impounded, depending on some details of how they managed the landscape. It's subsided, it's lost about 1 meter of elevation in a lot of locations. That means that it's respired a huge amount of CO2 to the atmosphere. This portion here is impounded and invaded with Phragmites, and it's an enhanced methane source. So we've been studying the methane and other greenhouse gas fluxes in this site for a number of years. And a quick summary here, this is in a paper that was just submitted by Rebecca Sanders-Demott, a postdoc in our group. And what she finds is that the impounded salt marsh is a really substantial source of methane to the atmosphere, here calculated as grams of carbon dioxide equivalents per meter squared per year. And we can talk about global warming potentials as well in terms of in the context of education. And while it's impounded and invaded with Phragmites, it's still a substantial carbon sink. It stores a lot of carbon dioxide as organic matter in the soil each year. On net, it slightly warms the climate because of the power of this methane. And the estimation is that in this impounded portion, if we were to remove the dike, which is pending and within about a year probably, methane emissions will be substantially reduced and soil carbon sequestration will be increased. And so the net here is much more substantially negative. So this is a natural climate solution, sometimes called, or blue carbon, since it's connected to the oceans. So the takeaways are that salt marshes and mangroves help to sustain a livable climate. For centuries, it's been widespread practice to impound and drain coastal wetlands. Those altered wetlands produce substantial methane and CO2 emissions. Sea level rise coupled with enhanced coastal protection measures. People are building more dikes and walls to keep the sea out. Those are a risk to the salt marshes and mangroves. Quantifying and inventorying the emissions and crediting reductions in the emissions through ecosystem conservation and restoration can incentivize quite a lot of ecosystem restoration. And I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kevin. That was a really wonderful, engaging talk about why we should be caring about our coastal wetlands, and they are accessible to people because they're on the coast, not out in the middle of the ocean.
Yeah.
So I know there's going to be a lot of questions, but I want to think about framing the rest of the conversation here about, I often do these workshops on concept mapping. So here we have some science and there's lots of different things here. The experience of living on the marsh, the idea of making a new instrument, the idea of a global problem that we're trying to solve. And then on the other side, a lot of us are educators and have an audience that we work with, and trying to connect through a series of steps between the science and the audience is how you generally design a program, an educational program. And so who would like to start with an audience that they would like to connect with, and then we can begin to sort of work together, and we might be able to get to several of these audiences. So speak up. And if you could unmute your video if you're able, I think that would help sort of the conversation.
I'm gonna grab some water.
Anybody have an audience that we want to work with here? And I think we'll get into a lot of the science questions.
How about teenagers?
I also see, I'm going to write a few down there. I also see Ellen's hand up. Go ahead, Ellen.
Hi, Bob. Thank you very much, Kevin. I'm wondering how you would make that, how you would use the time if you had middle school students that you were able to get out to the marsh on say Plum Island, Massachusetts, or Ipswich, that area, on so you could get them out to the marsh 4 times a year. So you have class time with them, and you could also get them out to do field work, and probably had the support and assistance of folks like Nancy Powell at Parker River National Wildlife Refuge, or people from Audubon. So there would be other supports. How would you spend that time?
And Ellen, I'm going to ask you a couple clarifying questions.
Sure.
Middle schoolers in a class or out of school?
Well, either, but I'm thinking about a class. So I work with a couple different schools, but I work closely with a charter school that has a van that just has more flexibility in terms of being able to access the marsh, and is very, a couple miles away.
And then a goal would be learning classroom science standards, or learning or engaging middle schoolers in science research.
So without going into it too deeply, the marsh could be used to cover both content and NGSS skills.
Yeah. Okay, so Kevin, I'll turn it over to you.
Potentially community, kind of community engagement kind of stuff also.
So Kevin, I'll turn it over to you to think about 4 visits a year for an hour or 2 with 20 kids tromping around the marsh over different seasons, and thinking about what would be the most inspirational, transformative experience for them under those sort of circumstances.
All right, and I hope you'll help, Bob.
Absolutely.
So first I'll just put a plug in for the Wacoit Bay National Estuarine Research Reserve. We've been doing a lot of work with them on this subject for lots of years, and they have produced some curriculum items. So if you go to their webpage, you might be able to find some ideas there that are related. So I think, one thing I've been able to see working on this subject, connecting not so much with kids, but with the public and people who manage the land, there's something about the fact that these ecosystems are so local. They're just right there, very accessible, and you can see them, you can touch them, you can walk on them, and yet they are part of our solution to climate change. And so I think, it takes this kind of big global problem and brings it down to the very local. So I think that kind of grabs people already in the beginning. So if getting those concepts across, that this is a local aspect of a global problem, and the fact that you can touch this soil carbon. I showed that one photograph of a profile. You can go to the edge of a marsh to a ditch or a creek, and you can see profiles, and pointing out to them that that's all that used to be greenhouse gas in the atmosphere. That used to be carbon dioxide, but it's been stored there and layered over thousands of years.
So Kevin, I'm gonna add something that I found very effective, is that we take kids and you line them up, hands wide apart in 2 lines facing each other, and then one line on 3 jumps up in the air and stomps on the ground. And the other line stands there, and what you feel is incredibly memorable, that the wiggly jiggly jello mucks around, and you go, whoa, this is really unstable. And what is this stuff, right, Kevin? It's all organic matter. It's all previous CO2 in the atmosphere. So they remember that experience, but they now have a connection. And then you can take, if you have the tool like an auger, an actual soil core, and go, see it first. Then it also smells, which is great because they remember that. But also that it is different than their normal dirt, right? And this is the carbon bank. And so then you can get into those concepts, Kevin, that you're talking about.
Yeah, and along those lines too, speaking of the carbon bank, it's worth connecting with soil carbon in general as well. It's not just these coastal wetlands, but most of the terrestrial surface has soil carbon at various levels stored. It's just that it's just more in the wetlands. So, I haven't thought a lot about experiments that you could do. One that, Bob just mentioned, a coring device. If you have there's something called a Russian peat corer, which is, it's a narrow steel tube with little blades on it, and you turn it in a circle and it cores the soil. You wouldn't necessarily have to have something like that. But there's a technique that people use to measure the rate at which the soil is building over time. And, it might be a little bit of a challenge in just, several months to be able to detect it. I don't know, Bob, if you've done this before. You can lay down something called a feldspar layer.
Yeah. We could put tiles or something out to look at accretion, or just look at it, ask the biologists that work in the marsh to show us how they study that.
And they have, I'm pretty sure, some SETs, some sediment elevation tables. So those are more detailed and complex way to measure accretion over time. They may be able to show you some ways to use that, or some data from that.
They'll be able to give you historical data that they have to tie into your 1 year with that,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Exactly.
It sounds to me like the big takeaway, more than the standards, and more than I don't know, I'm big on the skills thing, so I do like that, but more than hitting the standards, it's what you said is bringing up for me is just helping kids really understand how this area they drive by, the area that smells funky at low tide, is just how important it is, and just helping them feel that sense of pride and ownership and stewardship for our local
That's right.
markets.
Yeah, it's the appreciation of the ecosystem, the stewardship. The other things with 4 visits that, and Kevin, you can sort of help me along here. One thing that's striking is the September time versus like the April time, right? So there's large amounts of productivity, green grass that's sort of slowly turning colors in September. I know school year, August is harder. And then in April, it's dirt. I mean, it's mud. There's nothing growing, and the shoots just begin. And you're like, wow, all that grew in one season and then it died out. So that's like an impressive thing. The other thing, if it's safe, that is really cool, that I think a story that I tell is ice rafting. And so when you could get a picture from Kevin or me or somebody of like the bottom of the estuary, and there's these big blocks of mud in the middle of the channel, and boats can hit them and crash and sink. And you go, why is there a giant thing of mud in the middle? How does it get there? And people don't think about the fact that the marsh exists in the winter, because I never go to the marsh in the winter, but the ice traps the mud. It floats on the estuary in that tidal circulation, that intertidal exchange, and then it melts in the estuary and drops its mud in the middle of it. So it's a puzzle that it would be really interesting to like present that way. It's a cool scientific thing about a process that is not observed, but you can observe the results of it. And it's also true that you find pine trees and terrestrial soils in the middle of the North Atlantic from the same process. So you can tie it spatially, but it's something. Kevin, do you have good side scan sonar and stuff from transects in the estuary?
I don't. That's a little outside of what I've focused on.
I probably have some. You could probably find some, but it's a cool story that is sort of like a mystery, a scientific mystery, but that could be. I think middle schoolers might be really interested in that.
Yeah, you mentioned the growth of the vegetation. Another thing you could do if you're gonna go out 4 times through a year is do biomass surveys. So you put down a quadrat of 1/4 meter or meter. You count the stems, you measure their height, and then there are allometric equations that allow you to calculate the mass of that above ground vegetation. You could then calculate how much carbon is contained in that. So if you go one time in the spring and then you see that vegetation grow in, they could calculate for each square meter of marsh how much carbon was taken up by the plants. You could extrapolate that out over whatever area you wanted,
And you
the
could have
whole marsh
different
national.
groups do it, right? You could have a group of 4 or 5 do it in alterniflora, you know, near
Yeah.
the edge, and then
Marsh, low marsh.
the high marsh, and then the
Yeah.
Phragmites. Yeah, it would be cool to compare and have that. That's like real data graphing, but
Yeah,
experiential research experience. Yeah, it's
a
great.
little bit of math in there. Which,
Yeah, don't call it math, but
yeah,
does anyone else have some ideas on this theme of middle schoolers in the marsh? That there's a lot of good things added to the chat, resources and ideas, but anybody want to bring up any other ideas or questions?
Hi, Bob and everybody. This is Pat Harcourt, and I've had a lot of great marsh time with middle schoolers. One of the first considerations is first do no harm. And you got to make sure if you got a bunch of middle school kids that they understand that this is a fragile system and that they don't want it to be worse after their visit. But there are a lot of great simple observations they can make, and your best friend is to have each kid have a clipboard with a data sheet and have simple instruments that they can use to measure things like air versus water versus soil temperature, the wind direction, and simple observations. Now that they all have phones, they can take pictures of the vegetation. Maybe you'd have, maybe the leader can take one sample of a couple of different types of plants so that they could bring back to the classroom. But I think keeping it simple and just starting the students to give them an experience in a structured observation to answer specific questions. It's a terrific opportunity for them to do that.
Awesome.
And having pencils tied onto those clipboards with a piece of string.
Right. And I'm going to piggyback on Pat and say that we've had great success in taking very basic water quality, both in the marsh. And so we have an excellent space where we can go like in the marsh and then out where the marsh kind of flows out to, and looking at just simple water temperatures, salinity, dissolved oxygen, those basics, so that they get a real good understanding of the difference of the waters as it flows through the marsh. The other thing that we often do is throw a pair of binoculars on them and have them identify birds, because you know the birds love marshes, and some of the amazing birds that you can see, my favorite being the red-winged blackbird. So yeah, those are two really simple things you can do with your students.
Thank you. I see Nina put in this idea of the analogy. I really like, it's sort of a story, a sort of analogy to something that kids can connect with. This idea that it's a pillow, right? That migrating, you think of this one place and you go, it's not connected to everything, but it is definitely connected in a special way, supporting life on Earth. So the pillow analogy is great. The sponge analogy, you know, of soaking up water. And then this bank analogy, I've been thinking about this bank analogy, right? You take the carbon and you store it in the bank, and then you can make withdrawals, or if you drown the marsh or pave over the marsh, you can you know, the money can flow out. But I was also thinking that maybe gold bullion is a good analogy, in that you're changing the form of the currency, which is CO2. You're changing it into something very stable, and then it's out of circulation and it comes back. I don't know what you think of that, Kevin, this gold bullion versus the bank.
Sure. Yeah, I think that works. Yeah, it does change form. Another analogy could be conveyor belt. And I've got a little diagram, Bob, from the workshop that we did on lateral fluxes. It's just a little cartoon that shows an arrow coming down from the atmosphere and out into the ocean. And that's the pathway for carbon dioxide. And that is the main thing these things do, is they take the carbon dioxide and they put it in the ocean, and they don't store as much as they put in the ocean. So conveyor belt.
Awesome. Other ideas about if we weren't to get into the marsh, other applications for some of this wetland carbon sequestration, blue carbon ideas with different educational settings? So this Dari says, could we use GIS data? So this idea of using either Google Earth or GIS data or maps in the classroom to either do citizen science, identify areas like Kevin's doing, but have the kids do it on a similar or broader scale. So who wants to, Kevin, do you want to take the first shot at this? And
Well, I'll just say broadly that, scientists now, for the most part, publish their data. It's just a requirement for federal data, all the federal agencies. We put all the data on the web, publicly accessible. So it's not always super easy to find what you're looking for, and but you could find GIS data. You can find chemistry data. You could find flux data. You could find some of the types of either gas flux or water and dissolved carbon fluxes that I talked about today. I hate to bring up the word math again, but if people, depending on what level of work people are looking for, there could be certain applications of equations to do a calculation. And they could be as simple as global warming potentials, which essentially just says methane equals, and it depends on whose number you take, anywhere from 30 to 45 times carbon dioxide. So that's how if you have a wetland that's taking up carbon dioxide and storing it, and it's emitting methane back to the atmosphere, those are going in opposite directions. You multiply the methane by 45 and see which is bigger. Things like that.
Kevin, while data is available, quote unquote, publicly, teachers don't have a lot of time to go find it.
Yeah.
But there might be one image or one source that you as a active scientist know about. Could you think of, like you showed a great graph that said, here's these places that have been mislabeled, right? For land use. Do you have a website or an image that you could share with these folks, or could you think of something like that?
On that particular aspect, where that's still in progress, we haven't published that yet. I mean, I do have a paper in 2017, but it doesn't, it's not GIS data. Is that what you mean? Sorry, I'm
well, any kind of image, right? I particularly like, Google Maps, Google Earth that all kids are using anyway, and a way to, I mean, maybe it's just knowledge. If it looks darker green in the April image than the other place, and there's a straight line through it, that's it.
Yeah. So, well, let's see. The Buzzards Bay Coalition has a Google Earth image. I'm sorry, Google Earth analysis of road crossings on tidal wetlands in Buzzards Bay, for instance. That shows a point on each of the places where a road crosses a wetland and affects the ecology of the wetland. And so those are also very important for blocking fish passage and lots of other aspects of ecology.
So actually, I think it would be really interesting to have students do that, right? Say we're looking for coastal areas that have been impacted by human structures that are blocky or straight. And then you might notice in the image that there's a color change or a texture change or something. And so then this map as a backup would say, oh yeah, no, I identified that. And then, yes, that is a place, but then they're connected to it. I could imagine.
So sorry, to do that, actually, should I share my screen again for a second?
Yes, please. Yeah.
Okay. So they could go, so this image right here, that's the National Wetlands Inventory, NWI. It's published by the Fish and Wildlife Service, and it's a national map of wetlands, all wetlands. And these color changes that you were just talking about That's right there in NWI, and it is accessible as an interactive map. So they could do, as you just said, look for places where the color changes, which indicates a different kind of wetland, and see if there are these kinds of human features. So you'd have to look at NWI, and you'd have to look at a Google Earth satellite image.
And can you place that website in the chat?
Yeah. Stuff.
Anybody have questions or ideas around that?
There's a great resource called the Long Island Sound Curricular Resource Guide, and I'll post it in the chat. But it has lots of links to things teachers can use in the classroom that give actual connections to data sets that our area scientists have worked on. I'll be putting that in the chat momentarily.
Awesome. Thank you, Linda. Other ideas about blue carbon, wetlands, impacts, learning objectives for kids in these areas?
You know, you can set the methane on fire.
In the classroom.
That would get people's attention. I haven't done it myself, but somebody I know took in a class at the Marine Biological Laboratory, and they went out into some of the cedar bogs, which produce a lot of methane. There's no sulfate in there from seawater, and they put a funnel over the soil, and the funnel concentrates the methane into the little spigot. And then after some period of time, they lit it with a lighter.
Wow.
Yeah.
That would be cool.
You'd have to do some pre-experimentation to make sure you know a good spot, I guess.
The other thing that is often true is, sometimes it's hard to get the kids out, right? Or hard to get the kids engaged, even if you do have a trip going out. And so some things like bringing in some plant samples. So bringing the outdoors into the classroom or the museum or wherever you are. Here's alterniflora, here's patens, here's Phragmites, and here's a sample. Here's a soil blob or core or something. Here's a video of me lighting the marsh on fire. Something that, and they go, oh, I didn't realize that where's this marsh? I drive by that I didn't realize that it had interesting things in it. And so then it gets them more engaged and excited when they do go out, if they go out, or maybe they go out, maybe they don't have the opportunity that year, but another year, or they go by themselves or something. Images, videos, samples, bringing the outside in is another way, in addition to bringing the kids outside, because it's not always possible.
Just put a link in the chat for the National Wetlands Inventory.
Awesome, thank you.
Yeah.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
I just wanted to mention an experiment that we haven't tried yet, but that I'm excited to try. It's looking at edge erosion in the marsh. So you can, especially if you're going out multiple times with kids, you could put a marker at the very edge, of a creek, and then come back, a couple months later and see if there's been any erosion, and, think about how human activity is impacting the edge, and sea level rise and boaters and that sort of thing. And then another thing I wanted to mention is measuring the depth of the peat using this thing called a tile rod that goes all the way down to bedrock, and then thinking about how old is the marsh, how long has the marsh been accreting and storing carbon, and it kind of just gives a sense of deep time. And then you can even bring in indigenous history and indigenous use of the marsh, and we're trying to do a little bit of that at the Crane Estate in Ipswich. So
awesome. And
that's great. Yeah.
I also think about the colonial uses of marshes. They carve them up in lines so that they can feed their cows over the winter. That salt hay is the only hay that was around and available, and explains a lot of the property lines, actually. So there's a lot of historical cultural things in there that are really interesting.
A ton of history in there. Just one other quick example is every town has a mill pond, a pond that's called mill pond. A lot of those were tidal mills. So they would dig out part of the marsh, and when the tide would come up, it would fill up this pond. And then when the tide goes down, they have about 6 hours of water power to drive a mill. They're everywhere.
I think about stories a lot, and I think about characters. So we created a spokesbird for climate change, but is there a story or a character or something that any of you know that would engage kids in, again, marsh, smelly, always turn your back on, traditionally turn your back on these areas that are incredibly important, more important than rainforests in a lot of ways, that people have, oh, rainforest, I got those fancy poisonous free frogs and, chocolate. And so is there a story or a identity of a marsh that you can think of to just really engage, or that we could use to engage kids in these ecosystems?
If people have, I don't know, this is going to be different for different people, but I found horseshoe crabs to be really the charismatic ambassador. That was really, I find them to be really useful, and especially now with the pandemic. And you can teach everything from geological history to structure function to, technology, with using the horseshoe crab as the center.
Yeah, they're really cool and ancient.
Yeah.
Anyone else? I like to.
Of course, we have invasive green crabs in the marsh, so that's been kind of a hook that we've used. Any live animals, kids are excited about. So, teach them about invasive species and think about how the green crabs are impacting the marsh.
So I don't know if there's a small break between now and the 11 o'clock sessions. Any last questions, comments, reflections? And then I'm going to give Kevin a second or two to wrap up. Kevin, do you have any reflections on our conversation and broader impacts of your research, this type of thing?
Well, in terms of broader impacts, I think it's a relatively new idea that would be good to get across, that these ecosystems have a long history of contribution to climate change due to destruction and degradation, and restoring them has a very important role in mitigating climate change going forward.
I think that's really the goal here, right? Is that scientists have discovered the incredibly important value of these coastal wetlands, and the public are behind in that, and so it takes all of us on this Zoom call and many more to begin to increase the appreciation of that of these ecosystems by getting out there, by hearing stories, by learning science, all the things that we've talked about today. Thank you so much, all of you, for your contributions to this session. Thank you, Kevin, very much for a great talk and interaction and expertise. And we'll see you at the next session. Enjoy the rest of the day.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.